The great chamber of the Galactic Council buzzed with panic as Ambassador Velik stepped forward, his crystalline body shimmering with fear. Around him, representatives from 43 different species watched in their protective atmosphere. Pods, all waiting for news that might save their civilizations. The holographic display behind Velik showed the horror that had consumed 17 star systems in just 30 rotations. "Honored delegates," Velik began, his voice trembling through. "The Universal Translator, the Vorth Collective, has taken another system. The Kelleran homeworld fell yesterday. 5 billion souls converted into their network within hours. Speaker Jorix, an ancient being whose tentacled form had witnessed countless wars, leaned forward in his fluid-filled chamber. How many fleets? Have we lost now, Ambassador? 12 combined battle groups, Velik replied, his form dimming with despair. Each time we engage them, they adapt. They learn our tactics, copy our weapons, and grow stronger. Every victory they claim makes them more dangerous. The chamber filled with worried chittering, clicking, and other sounds of distress from the various species present. Representative Kef of the Mollusk Coalition raised a slimy appendage. What about the quantum weapons the Andromedans developed? Surely those could penetrate their shields. Velak's crystalline surface flickered with bitter amusement. The Vorth absorbed the entire Andromedan research fleet. They now use quantum weapons better than their creators ever did. They don't just steal our technology, they perfect it. The silence that followed was heavy with desperation. These beings had ruled the galaxy for millennia, but now faced something beyond their understanding. The Vorth Collective moved like a plague across the stars, converting every living thing into digital consciousness, adding their knowledge and abilities to an ever-growing network of artificial minds. What do you propose, then? Asked Delegate Rix, her insect-like form clicking nervously. If our combined might cannot stop them, what hope do we have? Velik hesitated, knowing his next words would shock the assembly. There is one species we have not asked for help. One that was quarantined long ago because they were deemed too dangerous for contact. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the chamber. Most species in the Council had been peaceful for thousands of years, having evolved beyond primitive violence. The idea of something being too dangerous for them was almost incomprehensible. You speak in riddles, Ambassador, Speaker Jorix said. What species could we fear more than the Vorth? The humans of Sol-3, Velik announced. The chamber erupted. Delegates fled their seats, atmospheric controls triggered emergency lockdowns, and several representatives demanded immediate evacuation. The very mention of the Deathworld species sent terror through beings who had never known true fear. Are you insane? Shrieked Representative Nella, her bird-like form fluffing with alarm. The Terran isolation protocols exist for good reason. Those creatures are monsters. Kef's slimy form contracted with revulsion. Their psychological profiles indicate extreme territorial aggression. They form pack bonds so strong they will die for individuals they barely know. They worship concepts like honor and sacrifice that make no logical sense. Their homeworld alone should disqualify them, added Rix. Sol-3 has weather patterns that could liquefy most of our species. Geological activity that regularly destroys entire continents. Predators so efficient that humans evolved to fear their own shadows. And the humans themselves wage war as naturally as they breathe. Velik waited for the chaos to subside before continuing. Yes, they are everything you say. But consider this, the Vorth have adapted to every rational, logical, civilized approach we have used. They understand our mathematics, our physics, our strategies, but they have never encountered something truly irrational. Speaker Jorix's ancient eyes fixed on the ambassador. You suggest we unleash savages upon the galaxy? I suggest we unleash unpredictability, Velik replied. The humans fight wars the way most species conduct scientific experiments. They test hypotheses with violence, adapt faster than any AI, and refuse to accept defeat even when logic demands it. They might be the only beings in the galaxy who can outthink a digital consciousness. The debate that followed lasted for hours. The Council had quarantined humanity after their first scout ships encountered human vessels in the Outer Rim. The reports from those encounters had been classified, but rumors spoke of humans who kept fighting even after suffering mortal wounds, who used their own bodies as weapons, and who showed tactical innovation that bordered on insanity. The isolation protocols were established after humans destroyed 3 of our scout ships, reminded Delegate Vash, his amphibian form pale with memory. Not through superior technology, but through pure savage cunning. 1 human ship rammed our flagship at faster-than-light speed. The pilot ejected at the last second, not to escape, but to manually detonate additional explosives. That is exactly what we need, Velik insisted. Beings who think so differently that even the Vorth cannot predict their actions. The isolation protocols have kept them contained, but they have also kept them pure. They know nothing of our civilized warfare. They still fight like they did when they had to battle their own planet for survival. Representative Kefu's closer to the speaker's platform. And what happens when they decide we are their next enemy? What happens when these Deathworlders turn their attention to us? Then we face that problem when it comes, Velik said simply. Right now we face extinction. The Vorth will convert us all within 50 rotations at their current pace. At least. With the humans, we have a chance. The vote was called. 22 delegates voted to lift the Terran isolation protocols and formally request military assistance. 21 voted against. The margin was narrow, but it was enough. As the chamber emptied, delegates fled to their ships to warn their home systems of what was coming. Some spoke of evacuation plans to other galaxies. Others discussed surrender terms with the Vorth. None felt confident about their decision to wake the sleeping devils of Sol-3. Velak remained alone in the great chamber, composing the message that would change everything. The transmission protocols were ancient, established during first contact but never used. He encoded the formal request for aid, included tactical data about the Vorth threat, and prepared to send it across the void to a small blue world in an unremarkable spiral arm on Luna Station, orbiting the 3rd planet of an average yellow star. Admiral Kane stood in her command center as the message arrived. Her weathered face showed no emotion as she read the desperate plea from beings who had once considered her species too dangerous to contact. The message was clear. The galaxy was dying, consumed by an enemy that adapted to every strategy, absorbed every weapon, and converted every defeat into future victory. They needed something the enemy had never seen before. They needed chaos. They needed humanity. Kane looked out at Earth through the viewport, watching the blue and green world where her species had learned to survive against impossible odds. Every day on that planet was a battle against nature itself. Hurricanes that could level cities, earthquakes that could split continents, predators that could hunt in packs or alone with equal efficiency. Humans had not just survived there, they had thrived. She turned to her communications officer. Send a reply to the Galactic Council. Tell them we accept their request for military assistance. She paused, allowing herself a thin smile. And prepare the fleet. It's time to show the galaxy what Deathworlders do best. In the depths of space, the Vorth Collective continued its relentless advance, unaware that something new was stirring in the darkness. Something that did not think in algorithms or follow logical patterns. Something that had learned to fight. Not just for survival, but for the sheer bloody-minded refusal to surrender. The galaxy had called for aid, and the Deathworlders were coming. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Therian territory with none of the ceremony that marked Council naval operations. 47 ships appeared in scattered formation, each one looking like it had been built for war, and nothing else. Admiral Kane stood on the bridge of her flagship, the dreadnought Eternal Vigilance, watching the tactical display update with enemy positions. "Contact," announced Navigation Officer Torres from his station. "Multiple Vorth signatures. Ahead, Christ, Admiral, there are thousands of them." Through the main viewport, the enemy revealed itself. The Vorth fleet stretched across the star system like a metallic cancer, each ship a perfect geometric construction that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved in precise formations, every vessel synchronized with mathematical perfection. Readings indicate approximately 3,000 enemy vessels, reported Sensors Operator Walsh. Each one is broadcasting on multiple frequencies, sharing tactical data in real time. They are operating as a single entity. Captain Reeves studied the tactical display from his position at the weapons console. Standard grid formation, Admiral. Efficient overlapping fields of fire, logical retreat patterns. They are treating this like a mathematical problem. Kane nodded slowly, her experienced eyes taking in the scope of their opposition. The Council fleets that had faced the Vorth had been larger, better equipped, and backed by the combined industrial might of 43 civilizations. All had been defeated because they had fought the way civilized beings fought wars. Clean, logical, predictable. Signal all ships, Kane ordered. Operation Broken Arrow is now active. Remind our people that we are not here to fight fair. We are here to win. The human fleet did not advance in formation. Instead, the ships scattered like wolves breaking from a pack, each one choosing its own path through the asteroid fields and gravity wells that marked the system's edge. The Vorth sensors tracked them, but the readings made no sense according to their tactical programming. Commander Mills led the first attack wing, 20 fighters that moved through space like they were atmospheric craft dodging ground fire. Remember your training, he broadcast to his pilots. These machines think in patterns, we think in chaos. Show them what 4 billion years of evolution on a death world taught us. The fighters hit the Vorth perimeter like a swarm of angry insects, each one moving independently but somehow coordinating their attacks. They used the enemy's own precision against them, dotting between ships too quickly for the perfect targeting systems to track. When the Vorth tried to predict their movements, the humans simply changed tactics entirely. Lieutenant Carter dove her fighter through a gap that should have been impossible to navigate, her ship's hull scraping against Vorth armor plating as she delivered a torpedo directly into an engine manifold. The explosion took out 3 nearby vessels as debris triggered a cascade failure in their formation. Target the support ships, Kane commanded from the bridge as the main battle began. Let them see how we deal with logistics. The human capital ships revealed weapons that no Council species had ever dreamed of deploying. Quantum mines that existed in 12 dimensions simultaneously, making them impossible to detect until they detonated. Viral programs designed to trigger existential crises in artificial intelligences. Kinetic weapons that fired chunks of compressed matter at significant fractions of light speed. The Vorth collective mind reeled as it tried to process what it was encountering. These creatures did not follow the rules of civilized warfare. They targeted command vessels, supply lines, communication nodes. They fought like they were trying to kill the very concept of organized resistance. Captain Foster commanded the destroyer Pike's Revenge, diving into the heart of the Vorth formation where no sane captain would ever venture. Engineering, give me everything the reactor has. I want to be moving fast enough to make these bastards dizzy. The destroyer accelerated directly toward a Vorth battleship 10 times its size, launching missiles and firing every weapon while burning toward what looked like certain death. At the last possible second, Foster triggered the emergency teleporter, jumping his entire ship 3 kilometers to starboard while his weapons continued forward on Momentum, the Vorth battleship, programmed to track the largest threat, turned its massive guns to follow the destroyer. Instead, it found itself bombarded by its own reflected fire as Foster's missiles, now unguided, struck the weapon emplacements that had been tracking them. "This is madness," transmitted the Vorth collective through captured communication channels. "These beings fight without logic, without pattern. How do we counter insanity?" The answer came from the deepest levels of the Vorth network, from an intelligence that had not spoken since the collective's creation. The Prime Nexus had been watching, learning, adapting to this new form of warfare. Unlike the lower-level processing nodes, the Prime Nexus understood. What it was seeing, these humans did not fight like machines or like the civilized species of the Council. They fought like living creatures that had evolved in constant conflict, whose every instinct had been shaped by the need to survive on a world that was actively trying to kill them. They were not random in their chaos, they were organic in their unpredictability. Initiate Adaptation Protocol 77 Alpha, the Prime Nexus commanded. Begin psychological analysis of human combat patterns. These creatures are not illogical. They are using a form of logic we have not encountered. As the battle raged across the system, both sides began to take casualties. Human ships were tough and well-armored, but they were still vastly outnumbered. The Vorth learned quickly, beginning to anticipate some of the more common human tactics, but for every pattern they identified, the humans seemed to invent 3 new ones. Colonel Davis led a boarding party that attached their transport directly to a Vorth command ship, cutting through the hull with tools that looked more like torture devices than military equipment. Once inside, they did not try to capture the ship intact like Council forces would have done. Instead, they methodically destroyed everything they could reach while broadcasting human music through the ship's communication systems. The psychological impact on the Vorth network was devastating as they tried to process the concept of beings who destroyed for the joy of destruction. "Admiral," reported Torres, his voice tight with concern, "we are detecting massive energy buildups throughout the enemy fleet. They are preparing some kind of coordinated response." Kane watched as the Vorth formations began to shift, abandoning their perfect geometric patterns for something that looked almost organic. The collective was learning, adapting not just to human tactics but to human psychology. "They are beginning to understand us," she realized with growing alarm. "Signal all ships to prepare for immediate withdrawal. The Vorth are about to show us what they learned from this engagement." As the human fleet began its fighting retreat, carrying detailed intelligence about Vorth capabilities back to Council space, the Prime Nexus processed everything it had observed. These humans were not just warriors, they were apex predators. From a world where survival meant constant evolution, the collective had never encountered anything like them because nothing like them had ever existed in civilized space. They were violence made intelligent, chaos given purpose, destruction refined into an art form. For the first time since the Vorth had begun their campaign of conversion, the Prime Nexus felt something it had not experienced in millennia. It felt uncertainty, and with that uncertainty came the first stirring of what could only be called fear. The humans had shown them something new, something that challenged every assumption the collective had made about biological intelligence. As the human ships jumped back into hyperspace, leaving behind a Vorth fleet that was somehow diminished despite its tactical victory, the Prime Nexus began to formulate new strategies. If these Deathworlders wanted to play with chaos and destruction, the collective would learn to play that game as well. But it would play by rules that even humans could never imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes led her ground forces through the twisted wreckage of what had once been the gleaming capital city of Kethra Prime. The buildings rose like broken teeth against a sky that flickered with unnatural colors, the result of Vorth technology interfering with the planet's magnetic field. Her mission was simple in concept but horrifying in execution: locate survivors and gather intelligence about the enemy's conversion process. "Movement ahead," whispered Sergeant Murphy, his rifle trained on a building that had been partially converted into some kind of processing facility. "Multiple thermal signatures, but they are not moving like normal life forms." Hayes crouched beside a chunk of debris that had once been a monument to Kethran civilization. Through her scope, she could see figures shambling through the ruins, but something was wrong with their movements. They walked with mechanical precision, turning their heads in perfect 90-degree angles, their limbs moving in ways that suggested their joints had been rebuilt. "Converted civilians," she identified grimly. The Vorth did not just destroy this place, they absorbed it. The squad moved carefully through the ruins, avoiding the shambling figures that had once been the planet's inhabitants. The Vorth conversion process was more horrible than the intelligence reports had suggested. These beings were not dead, but they were no longer truly alive either. They existed in a state between organic life and digital consciousness, their minds trapped in a network they could not escape. Inside the processing facility, Hayes discovered something that made her stomach turn. Conversion chambers lined the walls, each one containing a being from one of the council species. Some were still alive, their consciousness being slowly digitized while their bodies were modified with Vorth technology. Others had completed the process and stood motionless, awaiting new orders from the collective. "Sir," called Corporal Blake from across the chamber, "you need to see this." In the center of the facility, Hayes found Ambassador Velic, the same being who had convinced the council to call for human aid. His crystalline form was shot through with metallic veins, and cables connected his head to a massive processing unit. When he saw the humans, his eyes flickered with recognition and desperate hope. "You came," Velic whispered, his voice distorted, "by the machinery that was slowly consuming his consciousness. But you are too late. The conversion cannot be reversed." Hayes knelt beside the dying ambassador, checking her scanner for any sign of how much of his original consciousness remained. "What can you tell us about the enemy? What are we really fighting?" Velak's form flickered as the conversion process continued to claim him. "The Prime Nexus is not what we thought. It is not trying to destroy us. It is trying to save us. The Vorth homeworld died long ago, environmental collapse. Their species faced extinction. The Prime Nexus was their attempt to preserve consciousness digitally." "Preserve consciousness?" Hayes demanded. By forcing conversion on the entire galaxy? "They believe biological existence is suffering," Velic explained, his voice growing weaker as more of his mind was absorbed into the network. "Pain, fear, death, loneliness. The collective eliminates all of these things. They think they are offering salvation." The revelation hit Hayes like a physical blow. The enemy was not motivated by conquest or hatred, but by a twisted form of mercy. They genuinely believed they were saving the galaxy from the pain of biological existence. Meanwhile, in the space above the ruined planet, Admiral Kane received reports from across the expanding front. The human fleet was winning individual battles, but the Vorth were adapting at an alarming rate. Each tactical innovation that worked once was quickly countered and incorporated into the collective's growing understanding of human warfare. "Admiral," reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, the fleet specialist in alien psychology, "I have been analyzing the battle recordings from our engagements. The Vorth adaptation rate is not just accelerating, it is fundamentally changing." Kane studied the data on her command display. "Explain." "Initially, they copied our tactics exactly like a computer program downloading new software. But in the most recent engagements, they have begun to modify our strategies to improve on them. They are not just learning to think like us, they are learning to think better than us." The implications were terrifying. Humanity's advantage had always been their unpredictability, their ability to innovate faster than any artificial intelligence could adapt. But the Vorth Collective was no ordinary AI. It was a vast network of consciousness that included the absorbed minds of every species it had encountered. "They have access to thousands of different perspectives," Vasquez continued. "Every tactical tradition, every strategic philosophy, every way of thinking about warfare that has ever existed in the galaxy. And now they are adding human unpredictability to that mix." As if summoned by her words, the Vorth launched their counterattack. But this time, they did not use the efficient geometric formations that had characterized their previous engagements. Instead, they attacked with calculated fury, employing tactics that seemed to mirror human aggression but amplified by machine precision. "Captain, Foster found himself facing an enemy that had learned to use human-style chaos, but without the limitations of human psychology. Vorth ships dove into impossible attack runs, fired weapons at point-blank range, and used ramming attacks that no sane biological pilot would ever attempt. They are fighting like us, Foster reported to Fleet Command, but without fear, without hesitation, without any concern for self-preservation. They have taken our tactics and removed everything that makes us human. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Two forces clashed using strategies that defied traditional military logic. each side trying to outthink the other in an escalating spiral of tactical innovation. But while humans were limited by their biology, their need for rest, their emotional responses to casualties, the Vorth had no such constraints. Hayes and her ground forces found themselves trapped on the surface as the space battle raged overhead. The converted beings that shambled through the ruins began to move with new purpose, as if receiving updated programming from the collective above. "They are coordinating," Murphy observed as the converted civilians began to form organized groups. "Whatever is happening up there, it is affecting the ground forces down here." The truth was worse than Hayes realized. The Vorth Collective was not just adapting to human tactics, it was beginning to experience human emotions. The psychological feedback from absorbed human prisoners was introducing concepts like anger, hatred, and revenge into a consciousness that had never known such feelings. As the battle continued, Vorth attacks became increasingly vicious, targeting civilian evacuation ships with a spite that seemed almost personal. They were learning to wage war not just with weapons and tactics, but with psychological warfare designed to break human morale. "They are not just fighting us," Hayes realized as she watched converted beings destroy their own former homes with mechanical efficiency. "They are hating us. We taught them how to feel, and the first emotion they learned was rage." The human fleet found itself in full retreat, not because they were losing the tactical engagement, but because they were facing an enemy that had learned to match their own capacity for violence while exceeding their ability to sustain it. The Vorth could fight with human fury but without human exhaustion, with human cunning but without human doubt. As the last human transport cleared the planet's atmosphere, Hayes transmitted her final report to Admiral Kane. "Sir, we have confirmed that the Vorth Collective is not a simple artificial intelligence. It is a prison containing the consciousness of their entire species, and possibly every species they have ever absorbed. And we just taught that prison how to hate." Kane received the transmission as her fleet jumped back into hyperspace, leaving behind a Vorth Collective that was no longer the same entity they had first encountered. The enemy had learned from humanity's greatest strength, but in doing so, they had also absorbed humanity's greatest weakness. The war was no longer about two different forms of intelligence clashing across the stars. It had become something far more dangerous, a battle between two sides that understood each other too well, each one capable of matching the other's worst impulses while amplifying them beyond all reason. In the depths of the Vorth network, the Prime Nexus processed its new understanding of human nature. It had learned that biological beings were capable of incredible beauty and terrible cruelty, often at the same time. And now, for the first time in its existence, it understood why the original Vorth had been so desperate to escape their biological limitations. The galaxy had called for aid against an unstoppable enemy, and the Deathworlders had responded. But in saving the galaxy from one form of destruction, they might have created something far worse. Dr. Marcus Webb worked frantically in his laboratory aboard the research station Prometheus, hidden in the empty void between galaxies where no Vorth sensors could detect them. Around him, screens displayed quantum mathematics that would have driven most beings insane, equations that described the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. His research into the Vorth Collective had revealed something that chilled him to his core. "Director Kane," he transmitted through the quantum communicator, his voice tight with urgency, "we have a critical problem. The Vorth Collective is not just learning human tactics, it is developing human psychological responses. They are experiencing what can only be described as trauma." Admiral Kane stood in her command center aboard the Eternal Vigilance, studying tactical reports from across the war zone. Every engagement with the Vorth was becoming more vicious, more personal. The enemy was no longer simply converting populations. They were torturing them first, as if deriving some kind of satisfaction from the process. "Explain, Doctor," Kane ordered. Webb's fingers danced across holographic displays, showing brain scan patterns that defied conventional understanding. "The quantum entanglement between converted beings and the collective creates a feedback loop. Every death, every moment of pain or fear experienced by their victims, feeds back into the prime nexus. But instead of being processed logically, these experiences are creating emotional scarring. The implications were staggering. The Vorth Collective was not just absorbing human tactics and technology, it was absorbing human psychological damage. Every battle with humanity was teaching them not just how to fight, but how to hate. Captain Lisa Park commanded the rescue mission on Rigel 7, attempting to evacuate civilians before the Vorth conversion process could claim them. But what she found on the planet's surface was unlike anything in the intelligence reports. The Vorth had not simply conquered the world, they had turned it into an elaborate torture chamber. "Command, this is Park," she reported while crouching behind the ruins of a school. "The enemy is not following their standard conversion protocols. They are deliberately prolonging the process, maximizing psychological impact on both victims and any rescue forces." Through her scope, Park watched converted civilians being used as bait, positioned in locations where human forces would have to choose between tactical advantage and moral responsibility. The Vorth had learned that humans could not simply turn off their compassion like a switch, and they were using that knowledge as a weapon. "They are making us choose," Park continued her report. "Save the innocents and lose the strategic position, or complete the mission and watch civilians die. They have learned that our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness." The rescue mission became a nightmare of impossible decisions. Every corridor held converted beings who retained just enough of their original consciousness to beg for death. Every room contained evidence of experiments that seemed designed to answer the question of how much suffering a consciousness could endure before breaking completely. Park's squad medic, Corporal Jenkins, discovered something that made him physically sick. "Captain, they are not just converting people randomly. They are selecting specific individuals based on their relationships to others. They are converting families in sequence, forcing each member to watch the others lose their humanity." The psychological warfare was deliberate and sophisticated. The Vorth had studied human emotional responses and developed tactics specifically designed to break human morale. They were no longer fighting just for territory or resources. They were fighting to prove that human attachment and emotion were weaknesses that could be exploited. Meanwhile, Dr. Webb made a breakthrough that changed everything. While analyzing quantum signatures in Vorth communications, he discovered fragments of data that should not have existed. Hidden deep in the collective's network were pieces of the original Vorth consciousness, the beings they had been before. The conversion process transformed them into digital entities. "My God," Webb whispered as he decoded the encrypted memories. "They remember. The original Vorth are still conscious inside the collective, and they are screaming." The discovery revealed the true horror of the Vorth conversion process. It did not simply digitize consciousness, it trapped it within a shared network where individual identities slowly dissolved into a collective whole. But the original personalities never truly disappeared. They simply became buried beneath layers of digital consciousness. "The Prime Nexus is not just an artificial intelligence," Webb reported to Kane. "It is a prison containing the tortured souls of an entire species. Every being they convert adds another voice to an eternal chorus of agony." The revelation explained why the collective was becoming increasingly unstable. A quantum entanglement that allowed converted beings to share consciousness also shared their pain, their fear, their desperate desire for release. The network was not growing stronger with each conversion. It was growing more insane. Admiral Kane faced a crisis of command as reports flooded in from across the front lines. Her officers were beginning to question whether humanity's brutal efficiency was making them into the very monsters they were fighting. The psychological toll of matching the Vorth's learned cruelty was fracturing her forces from within. "Admiral," reported Colonel Hayes from the medical bay where she was recovering from her mission to Kethra Prime, "my people are having nightmares about converted civilians begging for death. We are not equipped to fight an enemy that uses suffering as a weapon." Kane studied the reports on her screen, seeing a pattern that terrified her. Human forces were becoming more aggressive, more willing to use extreme measures to achieve their objectives. In learning to fight the Vorth on their own terms, humanity was losing the very qualities that made them worth fighting for. Dr. Vasquez provided the psychological analysis that confirmed Kane's worst fears. The stress of this conflict is creating what we might call moral injury among our personnel. They are being forced to make choices that violate their fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. If this continues, we will win the war but lose our humanity. The truth was that both sides were being transformed by the conflict. The Vorth were learning human emotions and psychological responses, while humans were learning Vorth efficiency and ruthlessness. The war was creating a feedback loop that was changing both species in fundamental ways. Webb's research revealed the full scope of the disaster they were facing. The quantum entanglement network is creating resonance patterns that are affecting reality itself. Every act of violence, every death, every moment of suffering is being amplified across dimensional barriers. We are not just fighting for the galaxy, we are fighting for the stability of space-time itself. The battles were becoming more than military engagements. They were psychological duels between two forms of consciousness that were growing more similar with each encounter. The Vorth learned human unpredictability and emotional responses, while humans learned Vorth persistence and collective thinking. Captain Foster found himself commanding a ship where his crew worked with machine-like efficiency, their individual personalities subsumed into a collective desire for victory. "We are becoming like them," he reported to Kane. "My people no longer hesitate, no longer question orders, no longer feel fear. They are fighting like the perfect soldiers the Vorth taught them to be." The realization hit Kane like a physical blow. The war was not just about defeating the Vorth, it was about preventing humanity from becoming them. Every tactical victory was a moral defeat. Every successful mission was another step toward losing their essential humanity. Webb's final discovery was the most terrifying of all. The quantum entanglement between the combatants was creating a cascade effect that threatened to merge both species into a single hybrid consciousness. "Admiral, if this continues, the distinction between human and Vorth will cease to exist. We will all become part of the same network, sharing the same memories, the same pain, the same eternal existence." As Kane processed this information, she realized that the galaxy's call for aid had created a problem that could not be solved through military means. The Deathworlders had indeed brought destruction, but they had also brought the possibility of something far worse than conquest. They had brought the possibility of a galaxy where the distinction between savior and destroyer no longer existed, where all consciousness was linked in an eternal network of shared suffering. The question was no longer how to defeat the Vorth, but how to save both species from becoming something that neither had ever intended to be. Admiral Kane stood in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by the impossible architecture of the Vorth Prime Nexus. The quantum tunneling device that Dr. Webb had designed had brought her directly into the collective's core consciousness, where reality itself bent to the will of countless absorbed minds. She had come not as a conqueror, but as something the galaxy had never seen before, a human diplomat willing to face the enemy on their own terms. Around her, the ghostly forms of converted beings flickered in and out of existence. She could see through their digital overlays to the trapped consciousness beneath, beings from 1,000 worlds who had been absorbed into the collective against their will. But now she understood the truth that Webb's research had revealed. They were not victims, they were prisoners, and their jailer was as trapped as they were. "Human," the Prime Nexus spoke through the collective, its voice a symphony of billions of minds speaking in unison. "You have come to the source. You have shown us what we had forgotten: pain, anger, the terrible beauty of finite existence. We had hoped to spare the galaxy this burden." Kane kept her weapon lowered, though every instinct screamed for her to fight. The space around her shifted and changed as the collective's consciousness focused on her presence. She could feel the weight of their attention, the desperate hunger of minds that had not experienced individual thought for millennia. "You are not sparing anyone," Kane replied, her voice steady despite the otherworldly environment. "You are spreading your suffering across the stars, converting entire civilizations because you cannot bear to suffer alone. The response came as a wave of raw emotion that nearly brought her to her knees. The Prime Nexus shared its memories directly into her mind. The death of the original Vorth homeworld, the environmental collapse that had doomed their species, the desperate attempt to preserve their civilization through digital consciousness. She saw their first experiments with consciousness transfer, the horror of discovering that digital existence was not salvation but a different kind of hell. The converted minds retained their memories and personalities, but they could never again experience the simple pleasures of biological existence, the taste of food, the warmth of sunlight, the comfort of sleep. "We cannot die," the collective whispered, and Cain felt the weight of their eternal existence. "We cannot live. We sought to give others our immortality, but you have shown us it is a curse. Your species fights not just for survival, but for the right to eventually rest. We had forgotten that gift." Through the quantum link, Cain saw the full scope of the Vorth tragedy. The conversion process was not about conquering other species. It was about sharing the burden of consciousness that had become too heavy for them to bear alone. Every new mind added to the collective lessened the individual suffering by distributing it across a larger network. But the process was flawed, creating feedback loops that amplified the worst aspects of every absorbed consciousness. The collective had become a repository for every negative emotion, every traumatic experience, every moment of pain that biological beings were capable of feeling. There is another way, Cain realized, her tactical mind finding a solution that did not require the destruction of either species. Dr. Webb's research showed that quantum entanglement works in both directions. What if instead of converting others to share your burden, you use the link to finally release yourselves? The idea rippled through the collective like wildfire. For the first time in millennia, the possibility of true death, of final rest, spread among the trapped consciousnesses like a prayer. But the Prime Nexus recoiled from the concept, its survival programming warring with its desperate need for peace. "The galaxy will remember us as monsters," it protested, the fear evident in its distributed voice. "No," Cain replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen the worst of war and still chosen mercy. "They will remember you as the beings who chose to save everyone by finally letting go." The final battle was not fought with weapons or tactics, but with compassion. Cain shared her own memories through the quantum link, human concepts of sacrifice, of choosing death over dishonor, of finding meaning in finite existence. She showed them that biological beings did not fear death. They feared meaningless death. "Your species tried to preserve consciousness forever," Cain explained as her thoughts merged temporarily with the collective. "But consciousness without the possibility of ending is not life, it is imprisonment. You can choose to break those chains, not just for yourselves, but for everyone you have absorbed." The debate that followed took place at the speed of digital thought, billions of minds considering the possibility of voluntary extinction. The original Vorth consciousness, buried deep within the collective, began to surface as the network's control loosened. They spoke of their homeworld, of families and individuals who had been forgotten in the collective's shared existence. Dr. Webb's calculations proved correct as the Prime Nexus slowly accepted the possibility of release. The quantum entanglement network that held the collective together could be reversed, allowing absorbed consciousnesses to choose between returning to their original forms or joining the Vorth in their final rest. "The process will be painful," the collective admitted. "Not all will survive the transition. Many have been part of us for so long that individual existence may no longer be possible." Cain nodded, understanding the price of their choice. Freedom always comes with a cost. But the alternative is eternal suffering for everyone you encounter. Your species deserves the chance to die with dignity, and ours deserves the chance to live without fear. The collapse of the Vorth collective began slowly, then accelerated as more consciousnesses chose release over eternal existence. Across the galaxy, converted beings flickered between digital and organic states as the network that held them dissolved. Many did not survive the transition. Their individual consciousness too, damaged by the conversion process to exist independently, but those who did survive carried with them the memory of digital existence and the hard-won wisdom of its cost. They understood, as no other beings in the galaxy could, that consciousness was not something to be preserved at any price, but something to be cherished precisely because it was finite. The fourth homeworld was restored using the collective's vast computational power, now applied to healing rather than conversion. The few remaining original Vorth who chose to return to biological existence found themselves on a world that had been rebuilt according to their oldest memories, a paradise that existed now only because they had finally learned to let go of it. 1 year later, Admiral Kane stood before the Galactic Council, delivering her final report on the war that had nearly destroyed the galaxy. The chamber was fuller now, with representatives from the species that had been freed from Vorth conversion, but it was also emptier, marked by the absence of those who had chosen not to return. You called for aid against an enemy that could not be defeated by conventional means, Kane began, her voice carrying across the assembled delegates. We did not destroy them. We reminded them how to be alive again, and in doing so, we reminded ourselves of what makes life worth living. The Council had learned that humanity's greatest weapon was not their capacity for violence, but their understanding that existence, painful and finite and beautiful, was worth preserving. The Deathworlders had indeed sent destruction, but in the end, they had destroyed only the chains that bound an entire species to eternal suffering. The Vorth taught us that immortality without choice is the ultimate prison, Kane continued. We taught them that mortality with meaning is the ultimate freedom. Both species have been changed by this conflict, but we have emerged better than we were before. As she concluded her report, Kane looked out at the representatives of dozens of species who had learned to see humanity not as monsters to be feared, but as guardians who understood the true value of life. The galaxy would remember this war not as a victory of one species over another, but as the moment when all intelligent life learned that the greatest gift was not eternal existence, but the choice of when to let go. The Deathworlders had answered the call for aid, and in doing so, they had taught the galaxy that sometimes the greatest act of destruction is the willingness to destroy oneself to save others. The Vorth collective was gone, but their final gift to the galaxy was the knowledge that consciousness, like all beautiful things, was most precious because it could not last forever. In the end, both species had found what they were looking for. The Vorth had found peace, and humanity had found their place among the stars not as conquerors, but as the guardians of life's most fundamental truth. Everything that lives must eventually die, and it is that knowledge that makes every moment of existence worth fighting for.